thank you for joining us today. And on behalf of Press Super and Fellowship of Beyond Numbers, welcome to the year-end event for Fellowship Beyond Numbers. My name is Jason Fu, and I work in the investment team here at Rest. And I'll be your host over the next 40 minutes. We can sit back and enjoy today's an outstanding understanding of stewardship and the various challenges of living good stewards. And if you've been invited by someone and wondering what this Fellowship Beyond Numbers are about, it is a network of people who work probably in the numbers industry, so your accountants, actuaries, people work in superannuation, and I happen to be one of them. And we're an open network where people with different faith positions can join and engage in questions of life beyond numbers. So in addition to the quarterly events, Fellowship Beyond Numbers also has virtual small groups during the week where we keep encouraging one another through Bible studies. And later on in our program, I'll share a bit more information about how you can join some of these small groups. And let me introduce our distinguished panel today. We have industry leaders here who will be sharing their views on stewardship. First head of the rank, Raven Williams. Raven is principal at Jackson and Share. She'll be moderating our panel discussion. And we have Alexis Chang, who's head of investment stewardship at Teapot, and Chris Drew, the Australian equities here at West Super. So at the end of the panel discussion, you'll have the opportunity to ask questions through the Q&A. And so if you're online, you can submit them through the Zoom chat function. And if you're here in the audience, just raise your hands. So without further ado, let me pass on to Raven now. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason. Welcome, everyone, both here and online. I know I speak for Alexis and Chris and say it's really a pleasure to be part of this panel on a very topical issue or opportunity, which is stewardship. And I want to just take 5 minutes or so to give you a bit of an individual perspective of stewardship, but really then what we want to get to is the panel session with, as Jason said, some very distinguished speakers. So when I was thinking about what stewardship is or means to me, I actually got my whiteboard out and I thought there's this sense of balancing things in tension and being somewhere in the middle, so like a series of continuums. So, for example, we know that when we think about stewarding an asset or stewarding the earth, we know that it's not about bowing down and being subservient to the asset, but it's also not about pillaging and plundering the asset. It's something in the middle. So in that continuum, it's this idea of having a respectful kind of dominion over it without going too far one way or the other. The other ways that I think about it in this sort of context of continuum is in a temporal sense. So stewardship means we're not just focused on them, we're actually trying to balance those two into something in the middle where we have an obligation with respect to current things stewarding and the generations, but also handing over something to future generations. Another way I think of a continuum is that sense of how much we work or what kind of output we expect from the thing we're stewarding. So if we do too little, we fall short of stewarding because we're passive or indolent and something is lying fallow that we know actually should be bearing fruit and being harvested. But in another sense, we're not looking for maximum product, maximum output, maximum productivity. It's something in the middle. It's something like sustainable growth and sustainable harvesting. And then a sort of yet another continuum is this idea of, where do you sit as a steward? It's not all about you, but neither is it all about stakeholders. It's something in the middle where everyone who is concerned with stewardship is trying to lead and show some mentoring, that kind of mixture of other and self in the way that we steward. From a biblical lens, of course, we all know, and we read in the invitation to the very first book of the Bible, that the Creator actually asks us to look after his creation. So that's the very first concept of stewardship, really. But actually, the idea of stewardship, I think, is this beautiful golden thread that's woven throughout the Bible. It pops up everywhere. It pops up in the poetry of the Psalms, where we learn, for example, in Psalm 24, that the earth is the Lord's in all its fullness. I also think about things like the parable of talents, which, for those of you who know your Bible, is about when you're given something by an owner as a worker, do you bury it and just make sure you don't lose it? Do you grow it a little? Do you grow it a lot? So the Bible also teaches us about how we are meant to actually take something and help it to bear fruit and grow it, even if there's some courage and bravery required there. I also think that the Bible tells us about the character of stewardship in places like the books of Titus and Timothy, where we know we have some authority over something, and we're reminded in places like Titus and Timothy that extra standards are required of us, so we don't go too far. If we're meant to have authority, we're meant to not overdo it. We're actually meant to have a particular type of character traits in order to steward well. Just finally then, before we get to the panel session, I just want to touch quickly on why stewardship is something that our industry has really taken on. And I'm coming from a superannuation and institutional investment management perspective, but I do acknowledge that there might be some people from the broader financial industry here. But particularly from a superannuation perspective, stewardship, I think, is a thing because it aligns with the long-term horizon of superannuation, and also people will say or argue the long-term net return of perhaps net of risks focus. So it can be brought into that idea of growing superannuation savings for retirement by focusing over the long term over returns and risks in an investment portfolio. But stewardship is also, I think a thing because we have the right culture. I mean, trustees and fiduciaries are really stewards. They're really meant to be looking after assets and wealth and making decisions in the best interest of someone else. For a superannuation fund, that's the member. So the fiduciary culture is the right mindset for us to be stewards. We also know that the scale and influence of the superannuation industry, both here and the pension fund industry globally, is incredible. It's hard to get my head around it. So we know that Australian superannuation funds collectively, or APRA-regulated funds, manage about 3.3 trillion with huge growth potential. Globally, in Australian dollar terms, the pension fund industry manages about $56.5 trillion of assets. So, I mean, those figures are mind-blowing. And so I think that's led people who are in charge of these funds to say, we can actually move the dial. We can actually be a force for change in the industry. Let's use that for good. So stewardship has been something that's been taken on because we're able to actually make a difference. And I think tying in that with that is that the industry funds here have grown up from the power of the collective type culture. So they're very used to working together, I think, and sort of saying, what can we do if we band together? How can we really make a difference? A couple of other things, and then we'll sort of move to the panel session. I think stewardship's a thing for some in the industry because we know that superannuation is really underwritten by the government here. And so there is a sense in some ways that the government created the industry. We should be giving back. Might even be a sense that stewardship is increasingly part of our social licence to operate. And then finally, some people would say, plain and simple, the members want it. The members of super funds demand that we be good stewards. And so that's actually quite apart from everything else. good enough in itself for us to take on the idea of stewardship as an industry. So with that, I'd really like to bring in our wonderful panellists. I'm going to start with a question for each of you, and I'll start with you, Chris. How do you define stewardship, and what does that look like day to day in your professional role?
Yeah, so I mean, in its simplest form, for me, stewardship is looking for somebody else. So we, like you said, we've been entrusted, and we need to be good stewards of those assets. So look, yeah, I mean, REST has nearly 2 million members. So that's 2 million hardworking Australians who rely on REST to be stewards of those assets. And I think it's just about taking that responsibility really, really seriously. Like very often, it's the retail employee superannuation trust. So it's not high income earners. We know we have a young membership base, and they have very moderate account balances. And so we need to do everything we can to be the best stewards of those assets.
And you, Alexis, how do you think about stewardship? What does that look like in your role?
So I'm the head of investment stewardship for T Corp. So that's New South Wales Treasury Corp. For those of you who don't know us, we manage about $100 billion of the state's assets. So we're basically the asset manager for the state of New South Wales. About a third of that is defined benefit pension assets, and the rest is for insurance schemes and other government agencies and schemes. And similar to Chris, I'm probably one of the few people in Australia that actually has the word stewardship in their title, but there are a few others who are at the Women in Super Lunch. But, T Corp is very clear that we are the asset manager for the people of New South Wales. We manage the assets the government to enable the agencies to meet their mission. And for example, on the Social and Affordable Housing Fund, then the assets are not there to provide the services for those funds. So very much it is not our money. We are a service provider who has been brought in to apply a trade to grow the assets in a risk-aware way so that government agencies and stakeholders can meet their business objectives. I personally will be held to account to how we do that. We could do it in a way that maximizes return over the short term and maybe goes long into certain sectors that will create damage and liabilities down the track that will be counterproductive to those same agencies' mission and objectives. So for me, stewardship is really considering what we typically call extra financial risks or externalities like climate change, human rights, good governance, corruption, and saying, how can we take into account all of those risk factors and build the most resilient portfolios we can that can deliver that long-term benefit for the state? Beyond just being an asset of a steward of capital, I also manage a team of 5 people. I see myself as a steward of them. I need to treat them with respect. I need to make sure they are motivated to do their job. I'm also a mother, so I'm a steward of my children and our financial assets at home and what groceries we buy and all that stuff. I need to be prudent and responsible for those things too. So I think stewardship, I know exactly what it looks like in my day job, but I actually think the concept of stewardship goes far beyond just the work we do in the day job.
Yes, I can see Chris nodding too. You started to bring in the language of short-term versus long-term, which leads to the question of, well, what time horizons do you each manage to, and how does that impact your practice of stewardship? Starting with you, Chris.
Yeah, look, time horizon is very topical in superannuation. I'm not sure if any super people here, but you'll be well aware if you are of the Your Future Super legislation, which is an annual government assessment of returns marked 30th of June every single year. I guess what that's done for the superannuation industry is shorten that time horizon to some extent. There are things that we do in our day jobs which really does reflect that government imposed performance test, and it has brought some of those timeframes forward. However, this is not to say we are like hedge funds and churning the portfolio in such high rate. So I think it's really interesting in Raymond's open kind of talks about the temporal, the now and the future. Kind of have to manage to both of those extremes at once, which is difficult to do. But then reflecting the fact that we are ultimately managing for our membership base, and like I was saying before, we have a young membership base. They're mid-20s, early 30s, and so they have a 40+ year investment time horizon. So whilst we have to ensure that we're kind of managing to our broad objectives, and one of those is passing the Your Future, Your Super test, which is to survive and make sure we can still keep doing what we do for our members, but then acknowledging the long term is what matters. And so what that looks like in my particular sphere, looking after the equities portfolios, we know we're going to be holding some Australian listed companies for a decade, if not more. There are things that we can do with that mindset in working with the companies in which we invest. There may be times we have less or we have more invested. So kind of to take an example, Santos, everybody knows the company Santos. They're a major kind of oil and gas producer in Australia. So part of our kind of responsible investment and stewardship objectives is to contribute to decarbonisation of society. And so you say, how does that go hand in hand with investing in something like Santos? Well, we know that gas plays a big part in that transitionary phase. We can't go from a fossil fuel production of energy to a fully renewable future overnight. There are tremendous costs involved to get from point A to point B. And so we go and engage with someone like Santos, and we use the fact that we will be a shareholder for an extended period of time, over a decade or more. And we will encourage them, whilst they are involved in the energy transition, what is it that they can do in the near term to decarbonise their own business? And so again, we come down to this short-term versus long-term. When we talk to some of our investment managers, they say, oh no, we just want Santos generating tremendous amounts of cash flow right now. Everyone's seen their energy bills, and Santos is a beneficiary of that. And so the investment managers who do have a short-term horizon, then have a multi-decade approach, they'll say, we just want the cash flow back now. We can go and reinvest in something else. We say, no, we see a role for Santos in the decarbonisation path, and so we will go and engage with the company, and we'll encourage them. What if you take a portion of your cash flows to invest in decarbonisation strategies? We don't know what the technology will look like, but we are strongly encouraging those companies to do that. And it's that real mix of short and long term.
Oh, well, I think that's terrific to get a really practical example like that. Now, Alexis, T Corp's not subject to the Your Future rules, but
very lucky.
Yeah. So, but I guess it's not as simple as saying, therefore, you're able to just manage to the long term. What does that look? What does the time horizon look like for you?
Yes, so people probably don't realize, but T Corp actually manages 14 different portfolios, and they have vastly different time horizons. The fund will be completely gone in 6 years' time, and the longest is a perpetual fund. It's basically a state sovereign wealth fund. So we need to manage the portfolios in a way that's consistent with the objective and the horizon of each of those funds. Nevertheless, our commitment to investment stewardship applies to all of our funds, whether it's going to be completely down to zero in 6 years, or if it's going to go on forever. But the kinds of investment decisions we can make in light of that time horizon will be very different. So for the perpetual fund, we'll have a lot more real assets. We can invest in things like data centers. We have a waste to energy business in the UK that's really interesting. It's actually reducing methane emissions from landfill and contributing to the decarbonization journey there. But for a fund that will be completely liquidated in 6 years, that we can't allocate that capital to that asset. We share Rest Super's commitment to active ownership. So to say we're an investor, we need to have a voice and use that voice wisely to encourage all the companies in our portfolio, whether they're public companies or private companies, to steward that capital well, and that includes good stewardship of their human capital and their natural capital to create value. And I think that's a word I take really seriously. We're not just kind of about wealth creation. We want to create lasting value for the communities that these companies operate in, and really for the state. So where we have a choice of making, extravagant returns now, but at great cost later, the state government is going to be around for a very, very long time, I imagine. And so we need to take that long-term view, even if the portfolio's specific horizon is a bit shorter. What that time horizon for the funds really means is how much liquidity risk we can take, how much equity risk versus more defensive investment, strategies will apply.
Yeah. So just talking about T Corp being a public sector or government entity, does that mean it feels it has a special or a higher set of responsibilities around stewardship because might call it an arm of the government at Mercer for the last 10 years. So I know what it's like in the private sector. I think, T Corp takes its role there. Part of our mission statement says we are there to support the government to meet its objectives, and we service the New South Wales government family. So we think of it as family. So in a certain sense, yes, we have a higher obligation because we need to make the family proud. We have more scrutiny. We get, our CEO gets questioned at budget estimates. The treasurer was on Q&A last night. So the questions that will be asked about T Corp can take on a political tinge. So that puts kind of perhaps different pressures on us than it might for an insurer or a superannuation fund. But the flip side is also true. Because the community of New South Wales is so diverse, there are certain things we can't do. For example, even if I wanted to, and this is kind of getting to a question I know you're going to ask, even if I wanted to say gambling is really damaging to the community, and we should Wales quite enjoy the pokies or betting at the Melbourne Cup, and the state makes substantial tax revenue from gambling. So it would be inappropriate for T Corp to take a view like that unilaterally, given the diversity of views in the state. So we need to take our fiduciary duty first and integrate sustainability factors. But we have to be cautious that we don't take too much of an ethical lens where the investment case doesn't stack up. Okay. I can already see this idea of balancing things in tension, is coming through in a lot of the responses. So, Chris, turning back to Rest, where does Rest think that its commitment to stewardship will have the most impact?
Yeah, look, I guess it comes back to that longer term perspective that we can bring. And you've used that word impact, and we actually have impact investing as a separate sleeve within the portfolio. So I'd say that's where we think we can have the biggest impact. Maybe to give a bit of kind of a background there, impact investing is what we see as using our members' money to make a genuine difference in society as a whole. So I'll jot down some examples. Being part of Australia's renewable future. So there's a massive, I think it's estimated $320 billion worth of capital required for Australia to go from its current energy production to a renewable future. It could be multiples of that once they actually start the projects. Rest is a $70 billion funds and growing with very strong cash flows. And so we see kind of that having an impact, a real world impact, and using our members' capital to do that. But we think there's also opportunities in the listed space, which is kind of falls under my remit, where we're looking to partner with some external investment managers to we're kind of I guess releasing some constraints. So saying you don't have to, like, generally when you would invest with an external manager, you'd say, okay, you have a 3-year investment horizon. That 3-year investment horizon involves we're looking at some longer term managers who may be investing on a 10 to 15-year basis and saying, we don't need all of those returns up front. We are happy to generate flat or potentially even negative returns as they incur some cost in the short term to go and make those real world impacts in the future. So, one particular example is a healthcare company based in the US who are specializing in the diabetics. They may know, but you have the chip in your arm and you have the app, and it monitors your blood sugar levels in real time. They kind of are trying to ramp up production. There are tremendous health benefits that they can generate from that, as well as monitoring the symptoms in real time. They're looking at ways, how can we encourage society to reduce the sugar intake, to live healthier lives, so we don't need the diabetic assistance.
Okay. Yeah, the practical examples are really fascinating, Chris. But where do you find it hard, or Rest? Where does Rest find it hard to be a good steward? What are the roadblocks?
Probably a lot of the stuff we've talked about already.
Time horizon?
Time horizon really is, there's such a divergence between investing over the long term and needing to meet short-term performance goals. That would be one. Even how we maybe talking more broadly about superannuation, I'd say superannuation industry has thrived on being opaque through many years. Like a lot of individuals, their money just leaves their paycheck. There's been a lot, I'd say, poor behaviour within the superannuation. It's a safe room.
I know about that there.
Yeah, well, where's it going?
Channel 7.
Yeah, that's it. So I've lost the train of thought. No, that's all right. That's all right. Yeah.
You just said other roadblocks.
I'd say, look, I don't think it's a roadblock for Rest. It's talking more broadly about the superannuation industry.
Opaqueness.
Opaqueness. How do we? It really comes back to that stewardship theme again. How do we genuinely ensure that we are proper stewards and not full stewards and just reaping all the benefits that come from a mandated cash flows coming in all the time?
And what about you, Alexis? Where do you find does it find stewardship hard in certain areas, and where would you like to see the most improvement?
So one of the, again, forgive me for those of you who aren't in funds management, but hopefully we're keeping you with us. One of the areas I spent quite a lot of time in my first 6 months at T Corp is looking at fixed income, government bonds. How can you be a good steward of government bonds? Even with $100 billion in assets under management, T Corp will have very little influence over the US government, the UK government, the Chinese government. So where we have concerns about the way that those governments are governing, whether it's on fiscal policy or economic policy or human capital policy, human rights, labor standards, health and safety, we have to recognize that there is very little influence we're going to have over government bond issuers. And so we have to take a view of, will we be rewarded for the risks we're taking in buying, for example, government bonds? Will we get our capital back? And can we look in the mirror and say we're being good stewards of these assets that don't belong to us? And that is often a hard decision, because there are some things that many governments do that would not look consistent with our ESG beliefs. And yet it's very difficult to not invest in them for long-term risk-adjusted return reasons. It is a very challenging place to find the balance. That would be the one I spent the most time on in my first 6 months at T Corp. I guess the second one would be, there are some really interesting sustainable investment opportunities, but the evidence for long-term returns is not particularly strong. So we don't have an impact sleeve at T Corp at the moment. The New South Wales government has lots of other ways that they allocate to impact investing, and I'm sitting opposite Nick Tan, who is part of the Office of Social Impact Investing. So there are other places that the government can do impact investing, but we don't do it within T Corp at the moment. And that means, for example, someone's brought me recently a First Nations Australian equity fund, which I think looks really fascinating, but it will be pretty difficult for us to allocate to that given our current setup. It's not impossible, but it will take some flexibility to find a way to get that in there. So I'm glad there are other pools of capital that can be a little bit more able to tap into those, but it's a limitation for us in some cases.
Yes, okay. One thing that comes to mind too is the ASIC investigation, the greenwashing too at the moment. So obviously the regulators think that not everyone's being honest about whether they're actually stewarding or not. Topic for another day, perhaps. Because I'd like to go from the organisational to personal and ask each of you as Christians what you bring to the task of being a good steward as Christians in this industry, and you might even have some Bible verses or something that help with how you approach it. We might start with you, Alexis.
Sure. So interestingly, I basically became a Christian and started in sustainable investing at a very similar time in my life. I was about 25. I got the job before I got faith, but they were very similar timing. And even before I really decided as an adult I wanted to follow Jesus, because I grew up in the church, there was a verse that always really resonated with me, which is, it's from Matthew 25. And I'm going to paraphrase because it's a little bit long, but basically, Jesus says, when you clothe those who are needing clothes, when did you visit me when I was in prison? When did you feed me when I was hungry? When did you give me a drink when I was thirsty? Then he goes on to say, as you did this unto the least of my brothers and sisters, you did this unto me. So I think I was raised in a family that cared about the people in our community and the people around us. And so I love my work because I get to think about those things in my investments. I get to think about, is this company treating its workers well? Is it safe to work there? Is there harassment going on there? And if there's not, I get to be a voice for the voiceless on behalf of the capital to say, it's not okay to abuse your workers, to have bullying. It's not okay to use slave labor in your supply chain. And I actually get to do that as part of my voice. So after becoming a Christian around age 25, then when people ask me, what do you do for work? I was often a bit coy and I would say, I call companies. And that's one of the benefits of being a steward. I guess the other passage that I take very personally is, the earth is the Lord's and everything in it, and that includes everyone in it. And so if I've had a bad day and I've been short with my colleagues, or I've gotten in a fight with my son, I go to bed thinking, the Lord is going to call me to account. And I take that really seriously. And so every night before I go to bed, I have a prayer journal, and it's thank you, sorry, please, 3 columns to say, thank you, God, for this day that you've given me and the chance to be a steward of whatever you've given me today. But I've come up short in numerous ways, and I need to say sorry. And please can you help me tomorrow to live for you and to be a good steward of everything you put in my path. So.
Wow. No pressure, but hard
So yeah, I think you mentioned Titus in the intro, and that was actually the verse that I pulled out. Which I'm just going to read Titus chapter 1, verse 7. For an overseer as God's steward must be above reproach. He must not be arrogant or quick-tempered or drunkard or violent or greedy for gain. There's a lot in there. It's confronting. I love that above reproach, and really it's how I how I try to live my life. When I do hold a reasonably senior role within REST, and displaying actions that I've known, because I've worked in super my entire career, and I've seen the impact that those above you can have on your own career. And so with my own team, I try to kind of have that mindset of being above reproach and just demonstrating life. It's how you talk to your team. It's how you lead. It's a servant leadership style as well. Never asking anybody to do anything that you wouldn't do yourself. And just trying to display some of them. Yeah, look, I mean, I kind of had a go at the super industry before, and I'm going to do it again. It is a job that I'm in, and Alexis is in, that you can allow yourself to kind of be subject to personal gain. There are temptations, there are financial benefits that can be gained in our roles. There's no shortage of service providers who are willing to do what it takes to win our business. So again, it's keeping that godly above reproach and knowing that you can't have a different character depending on who you're talking to. It's consistent single character, which is kind of focused around that, being above reproach. Just one thing that came to mind as well, directed towards men, so forgive me the girls in the room, but the pastor kind of said that the 3 areas where men trip up is the 3 Gs of gold, glory, and girls. And I guess that, like, when I think about being a steward and living, it's all captured there in that title's words around being greedy for gain and being a drunkard and being above reproach. Really kind of thinking about those 3 key areas of my life: gold, glory, and girls.
Yeah, I think it's interesting that what we've brought out in these wonderful, intelligent responses. One is that when we talk about steward, we're not just talking about a relationship to an earth or the asset. We're actually talking about a relationship to everything in our lives, really, and how we steward. Another thing that I love is that we can talk about stewardship in terms of actions, behaviour, but actually what you both brought out is that it is actually about character. So character attributes, as important as anything that we do. It's actually who we are in terms of stewardship. So organisationally, what the organisation represents, but the people in it, that are the influences and sort of character they have. So to leave a bit of room for questions, I just want to finish by asking you each, start with you, Chris. How do you think the industry's commitment to stewardship could point more people towards the Bible and God?
Yeah, look, I mean, we all know being a Christian in modern society is difficult, and I guess the financial industry, potentially even more so, becoming very liberal and difficult to have a voice. So I think it's about building those small relationships. Alexis mentioned earlier, in charge of God's art, and something that resonates. We even know it resonates with looking after the planet. And so you kind of start with that conversation and then bring the Christian lens over it. But yeah, these things are very difficult.
No, that's good. And Alexis, so do you see sort of this just industry conversation about stewardship as something that you can sort of use to weave in your Christian faith?
I do, yeah, for sure. So I do a lot of public speaking about things like climate change, slavery, and from a Christian point of view, I deeply believe in those things and care about those things, so that's easy. But some of you know me for a little while, some of you don't. I like to turn the screw sometimes. So I will often say, remember that retirement is not the end. You know, particularly within superannuation, the industry focuses on retirement and then they shift you to post-retirement and give you some other products. But death is the great equalizer. Some of us will retire early and then die. Some of us won't have the luxury of retiring ever, but we will all die unless Jesus comes back first. So rather than focusing just on what is my super account balance, what is my balance in heaven look like? And what will you do, not when your employer bids you adieu into retirement, but actually in your face-to-face. So.
Thank you.